What if I told you that every single dream you have ever forgotten was actually trying to tell you something you were too afraid to know? For thousands of years, dreams were treated like ghosts. Something strange that visits you at night and disappears by morning, leaving no evidence behind. Ancient people thought dreams were messages from the gods. Some cultures believed they predicted the future. Others thought they meant nothing at all, just random noise created by a tired brain. And then, in the final years of the 1800s, one man in Vienna sat down every single night and did something nobody else was doing. He wrote down his dreams. Not just the exciting ones, all of them. The confusing ones, the embarrassing ones, the ones that made no sense at all. And slowly, he began to notice a pattern hiding underneath the chaos. That man was Sigmund Freud. And the book he eventually wrote from those notes would go on to change the way human beings understand their own minds forever. But here's something most people don't know. Freud didn't start this project as a detached scientist studying strangers from a safe distance. He started it during one of the most painful periods of his own life. In 1896, Freud's father died. And instead of simply grieving quietly and moving on, Freud did something almost nobody in his profession was doing at the time. He turned the analysis inward on himself. He began recording and interpreting his own dreams, night after night, treating his own mind as the most important case study he would ever have access to. In many ways, this book is not just a scientific theory. It is also, quietly, one man's attempt to understand his own grief, his own ambition, and his own hidden conflicts, using the very method he was inventing as he went. But here's where it gets strange. When Freud first published this book in 1899, almost nobody bought it. In the first 6 years, it sold fewer than 400 copies. The medical world mostly ignored him. Some critics mocked him. Yet Freud himself believed this was his greatest work. He once said that an insight like this comes to a person only once in a lifetime. So what did he see that everyone else was missing? Why did a book that barely sold when it came out become one of the most influential books in the history of psychology? To understand that, you have to understand the world Freud was living in. This was Vienna at the end of the 19th century, a city obsessed with logic, science, and order. Doctors believed the mind could eventually be explained the same way you explain a broken bone or a failing heart. Emotions were seen as unreliable, irrational. Something to be controlled, not studied. And dreams, especially, were considered beneath serious science. Dreams were dismissed as leftover static from a resting brain, like the fuzz on an old television screen after the channel goes off air. Freud disagreed completely. He believed dreams were not noise. He believed they were messages. Encrypted, disguised, sometimes frightening messages sent from a part of your mind you don't even know exists while you're awake. Now, before we go any further, we need to talk about the idea that changed everything for Freud. The idea that his entire career, and honestly a huge part of modern psychology, was built on top of. The unconscious mind. Here's a simple way to picture it. Imagine your mind is an iceberg floating in the ocean. The small part you can see above the water, that's your conscious mind. It's what you're aware of right now. The thoughts you're having, the words you're reading, the plans you're making for later today. But underneath the surface, hidden beneath the waterline, there's a massive, much bigger part of the iceberg that you cannot see. That's the unconscious. It holds memories you've forgotten, desires you're ashamed of, fears you've buried, and feelings you've never allowed yourself to fully admit, even to yourself. Freud believed that during the day, your conscious mind acts like a strict security guard. It filters out anything uncomfortable, anything shameful, anything that might disturb your sense of who you are. But at night, when you sleep, that guard finally relaxes. And that's when things hidden underneath start slipping through the cracks. That, according to Freud, is what a dream actually is. But this raises an obvious question. If dreams come from something hidden and forbidden, why don't your dreams look like clear confessions? Why do they look like strange, confusing, sometimes absurd little movies instead? This is where Freud introduced one of his most important distinctions. Every dream, he said, has 2 layers. The first layer is what he called the manifest content. This is simply the dream as you remember it. The actual images, characters, and events that play out while you sleep. Flying over your old school. Losing your teeth in public. Being chased through a house that keeps changing shape. But underneath that strange surface story, Freud believed there's a second, deeper layer. He called this the latent content. This is the real meaning. The hidden wish, fear, or memory that the dream is actually about, disguised so cleverly that even you, the dreamer, don't recognize it. Think of it like this. The manifest content is the cover of a book written in a language you don't understand. The latent content is the actual story printed on the pages underneath, waiting for someone who knows the code to translate it. And Freud believed he had found the code. At the very center of that code was a single, bold claim. One that shocked readers in 1899 and honestly still surprises people today. Every dream, Freud argued, is the fulfillment of a wish. Now before you say that doesn't match your last nightmare, stay with this for a moment, because Freud's version of a wish is much broader than you might expect. It doesn't have to be a wish you're proud of. It can be a wish you find embarrassing, selfish, aggressive, or even frightening. A wish for revenge, a wish for forbidden love, a wish to escape a responsibility you secretly resent. Freud believed that even nightmares are attempts at wish fulfillment, just wishes so threatening that the mind has to disguise them heavily, sometimes turning them into fear instead of pleasure, simply to make them bearable enough to experience at all. Here's a simple example. Imagine a child is told she cannot eat any more sweets today. That night, she dreams she is at a table piled high with cake and candy, eating as much as she wants. Freud actually studied dreams like this in young children, because in kids the wish fulfillment is often shockingly direct, barely disguised at all. Adults are different. Our wishes are usually far more complicated, tangled up with guilt, morality, and fear of judgment, even fear of our own selves. So adult dreams need heavier disguises. And that disguise process is where things get truly fascinating. Freud called this transformation process dream work. It's the mental machinery running behind the scenes every single night, translating your raw, forbidden latent wishes into the strange, scrambled manifest dream you actually experience. And dream work operates using several specific techniques. The first is called condensation. This is when your mind takes several different people, memories, or ideas and blends them into a single dream image. Ever had a dream where a person looked like your old coworker, but somehow you knew, deep down, that it was actually your father? That merging is condensation at work. Your mind is compressing multiple emotional threads into one symbol, so a single dream character might silently be carrying the emotional weight of 3 or 4 real relationships at once. The second technique is called displacement. This is when the emotional intensity of a dream gets shifted away from the thing that actually matters and attached instead to something that seems minor or even irrelevant. Imagine you're furious at your boss, but you'd never admit that anger even to yourself. That night, you dream about a broken pencil, and somehow you wake up feeling strangely, intensely angry about it. Freud would say the pencil isn't really the point. The pencil is a safe stand-in, a decoy, allowing you to feel the emotion without confronting its real, more dangerous target. And the third major technique is called secondary revision. This is your mind acting almost like an editor after the fact, smoothing over the strange, disconnected fragments of a dream into something that feels like it has a story, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Even when the raw dream material was really just scattered, disjointed pieces, secondary revision stitches it together so that when you wake up and try to describe it, it sounds almost like a plot. So why does the mind go through all this trouble? Why not just show you the wish directly? Because, Freud argued, some truths about ourselves are simply too threatening to face head-on, even while we're asleep and alone with our own minds. So the unconscious builds a costume. It lets the wish walk on stage, but never without a disguise thick enough to fool the audience, which in this case is you. This naturally leads to one of the most famous and most misunderstood parts of Freud's entire theory. Dream symbols. Popular culture loves to reduce Freud to a simple dictionary. This symbol means this. That symbol means that. And yes, Freud did believe certain symbols appeared frequently across many people's dreams, often connected to universal human experiences like birth, death, and especially sexuality. But here's what most people get wrong. Freud never believed in a rigid, one-size-fits-all dream dictionary. He was very clear that the exact same symbol could mean something completely different for two different dreamers, depending on their personal history, their memories, and their unique emotional associations. For Freud, the meaning of a symbol was never guessed from a chart. It was uncovered through careful conversation, through a technique he considered absolutely essential to everything else in the book. Free association. This is exactly what it sounds like. The dreamer describes their dream, and then, without censoring or overthinking, says whatever comes to mind next, one thought leading naturally to another, even if it seems embarrassing, irrelevant, or strange. Freud believed that if you followed this chain of thoughts far enough, without judgment, it would eventually lead back to the hidden wish underneath the dream. The dream was the door. Free association was the key that unlocked it. Here's why this distinction matters so much, even outside of therapy. Think about how often we do this exact thing in waking life without even noticing. You feel a flash of irritation at a small, harmless comment from a friend, far more irritation than the comment actually deserves. Freud would ask you to pause and wonder, is this really about the comment? Or is this displacement, an older, unresolved feeling attaching itself to a safe, convenient target because the real source feels too big, too complicated, or too frightening to face directly? You don't need to believe every detail of Freud's dream theory to find that question useful. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do for yourself is simply ask, why does this feel bigger than it should? Now here's something that makes this whole book even more remarkable, and honestly, more personal than most scientific texts ever written. Freud didn't just study other people's dreams. He turned this method on himself. The most famous case in the entire book is known as the dream of Irma's injection, and it's widely considered the first fully analyzed dream in the history of psychology. In the dream, Freud examines a patient named Irma, sees something troubling in her throat, and feels a wave of anxiety, wondering if he made an error in her treatment. When Freud applied his own method of free association to this dream, layer after layer, he uncovered something startling. Underneath the surface anxiety, the dream was actually working to relieve Freud of guilt, shifting blame away from himself and onto other doctors. In other words, the dream was fulfilling a wish. The wish to be innocent. Freud was so moved by this discovery that he once joked, half seriously, that a marble plaque should be placed on the house where he had this dream, commemorating the exact spot where the secret of dreams was revealed to him. And that marble plaque was actually placed there, decades later, by admirers of his work. Think about that for a moment. A joke Freud made about his own dream eventually became a real historical monument, standing on a street in Vienna to this day. That alone tells you how far this idea traveled. But Freud didn't stop at wish fulfillment and dream work. He went even deeper, tracing many adult dreams all the way back to childhood. He believed that some of our earliest, most primitive wishes never fully disappear. They get buried, repressed, pushed down into the unconscious as we grow older and learn what is socially acceptable and what isn't. But Freud argued these infantile wishes remain alive underground, quietly influencing us for the rest of our lives, sometimes reappearing decades later, disguised inside a completely unrelated adult dream. A dream about missing a train, for instance, might trace back to a much older feeling of being left behind or abandoned as a small child, a feeling you consciously forgot decades ago but that your unconscious never actually released. At this point, you might be wondering something important. Is any of this actually true? Can it be proven? And this is exactly where modern science pushes back hard. Today's neuroscientists generally do not accept wish fulfillment as the full explanation for why we dream. Many researchers instead point to theories involving memory consolidation, emotional processing, and the brain essentially running background maintenance while the body rests, similar to a computer organizing its files overnight. Critics have also pointed out that Freud's methods were rarely tested using strict scientific controls, and his conclusions could be difficult to disprove because almost any dream could be reinterpreted to fit his theory afterward. If a dream seemed to fulfill a wish, that confirmed the theory. And if a dream seemed to contradict a wish, Freud could simply argue the disguise was working exactly as expected. To many scientists, that kind of reasoning is a warning sign, because a theory that can explain absolutely any outcome becomes very hard to actually test. There's also the criticism that Freud leaned far too heavily on sexuality as the root of almost everything, sometimes interpreting even the most ordinary, innocent dream objects as hidden sexual symbols. Even some of Freud's own students eventually pushed back on this. Carl Jung, once one of Freud's closest colleagues and a man Freud personally hoped would carry his ideas into the future, eventually broke away from him, partly over this very issue, going on to build his own, quite different theory of the unconscious mind and dream symbolism. So was Freud wrong? Not entirely, and this is the part that keeps this book alive more than a century later. Even scientists who reject the details of Freud's dream theory generally agree with something much bigger underneath it. The idea that we are not always fully aware of our own motivations. That parts of our mind can influence our behavior, our moods, and yes, even our dreams without our conscious permission. That single idea, that you don't always know why you feel what you feel, quietly reshaped psychology, therapy, literature, art, and even the way ordinary people today talk about themselves. Whenever someone says they had a Freudian slip or jokes that a dream clearly meant something, they are, whether they realize it or not, still living inside the shadow of this one book. And it wasn't only psychology that felt the shockwave. Artists felt it too. A whole movement of painters and writers in the early 20th century, the Surrealists, built their entire creative philosophy around Freud's idea that the unconscious mind speaks in strange, dreamlike images. Painters began deliberately trying to paint the logic of dreams onto canvas, melting clocks, impossible landscapes, images that felt emotionally true even when they made no rational sense. Writers experimented with stream of consciousness, letting thoughts spill out onto the page the way Freud believed the unconscious spills into a dream. None of that art movement exists in quite the same form without this one book quietly sitting in the background. And that's really the deeper lesson hiding underneath all of this. Freud's real gift to us wasn't a perfect, unbreakable science of dream decoding. His real gift was permission. Permission to take our inner life seriously. Permission to believe that the strange, embarrassing, confusing parts of ourselves are not meaningless glitches to be ignored, but clues worth sitting with, clues worth questioning, clues that might just lead you toward understanding a version of yourself you never fully knew was there. Because maybe the real value of this book isn't whether every single dream you have truly represents a hidden wish. Maybe the real value is simpler than that. It's the reminder that self-understanding takes patience. That your mind is layered, complicated, and worth exploring honestly, not just judged and dismissed. That sometimes, the most important conversations you'll ever have are the ones you have with yourself, quietly, in the dark, long after everyone else has gone to sleep. More than 100 years after it was first published, and after selling fewer than 400 copies in its first 6 years, The Interpretation of Dreams is now considered one of the most influential books ever written about the human mind. Not because every theory inside it survived unchanged, but because it dared to ask a question almost nobody else was asking at the time. What if your dreams aren't nonsense? What if they're trying to tell you something? Tonight, when you close your eyes and drift into whatever strange, disguised story your own mind decides to tell you, maybe don't dismiss it so quickly. Maybe, just for a moment, ask yourself the same question Freud asked over a century ago. Not what does this mean exactly, but what part of me is trying to be heard?